Back in 2001, Camilla did something the palace spent years desperately trying to bury. She took the Queen's private tiara without asking. Not just any piece. It was one of the absolute most sacred and personal items Queen Elizabeth owned, a specific tiara she had worn on one of the darkest, most painful days of her entire life. The moment Elizabeth found out what Camilla had done, she made a fierce decision that very day, and she never once went back on it. Not a single piece of her personal jewellery would ever be given to Camilla. Absolutely never. Camilla fought against that rule with everything she had for years. Then Queen Elizabeth died, and what happened next with all that royal jewellery was something nobody could have seen coming. The theft that broke the shield. Nobody noticed it at first. That was the exact thing about how Angela Kelly managed the Queen's private collection. Absolutely everything had its own specific place. And when a member of her staff finished a routine inventory check at Windsor Castle one afternoon in the early 2000s and reached the deep velvet tray holding the Burmese ruby tiara, she froze. The velvet tray was empty. The legendary tiara was completely gone. Her breath caught tight in her throat. She stepped back from that tray as if it had burned her, then ran straight to Kelly and spilled every single detail. Kelly's heart immediately started racing. She knew exactly what Queen Elizabeth believed about that special tiara, what those stones were meant to do, and what they were deeply supposed to protect. She walked quickly to the Queen's private rooms, and when she finally got there she could barely get the words out. Her voice was trembling. "It is gone," she said, "the whole tiara. Someone took it." The Queen went completely still for just 1 second. Then she stood up, pressed her hand hard against her chest, and rushed straight to the vault herself. When she reached that velvet tray and saw the empty space staring right back at her, her mouth fell open, completely wide open. And absolutely nothing came out. Not a single scream. The staff inside that room said they had never seen her look quite like that. She wasn't just upset, she was terrified. Then the rumours started whispering through the entire household. Camilla had been in the building that very day. A staff member had actually watched her walk into the room where the personal collection was laid out for the audit. And the exact moment someone came near Camilla had rushed out quickly, saying something about needing to be somewhere else, and that she would visit the Queen again next time. Now there was one heavy question no one dared ask out loud. Had Camilla actually stolen the Queen's sacred jewellery? The Queen was in an incredibly terrible spot. She couldn't just stand up and announce to the world that her personal jewellery had vanished. No, that would pull the press in like hungry sharks. It would completely humiliate the monarchy. So the search began in total silence. Conversations happened in whispers behind closed doors, and the Queen became a mere ghost of herself. Her hands trembled all through that painful week. She barely ate. And here is exactly why this piece mattered so much to her. The Burmese ruby tiara was not inherited. It was not passed down to her. Elizabeth built it herself in 1973, and the way she created it told you everything about what it meant to her. She took the Cartier Nizam of Hyderabad tiara, a breathtaking diamond piece given to her as a royal wedding gift by one of the absolute wealthiest men who had ever lived, and she destroyed it, pulling out all its diamonds. Then she combined them with 96 rubies the people of Burma had personally given her as a wedding gift in 1947. That number 96 was not chosen merely for decoration. In ancient Burmese tradition, rubies carried a living fire that no water and no darkness could ever put out. They protected the wearer from evil, from sickness, and from harm. And there were exactly 96 diseases recognized in Burmese medicine, one stone protecting against each one. Every single stone in that tiara was a specific act of deep protection built from fire gold, and the deep faith of a people who had suffered under British rule for generations, yet still sent their most sacred stones to the woman on the throne. Elizabeth wore it for the first time at the state opening of Parliament in 1973. From that moment on, it entered her life as a protective shield she strapped on when the world got dangerous. And the world got incredibly dangerous. And somehow, Queen Elizabeth believed, really believed, that everything that happened to her would have been far worse if it were not for that tiara. In 1992, everything collapsed at once. Her son Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson, who had already been photographed in the south of France, having her toes sucked by her financial advisor while still a senior working royal. Those shocking photos ran on front pages worldwide. The Queen had genuinely liked Sarah, and she watched her burn everything down in the most degrading way imaginable. Just 2 months later, her daughter Queen Elizabeth suffered even more tragedies. Anne finalised her divorce from Mark Phillips. A second royal marriage destroyed within weeks of the first. Then in June, a book arrived that completely tore everything wide open. Andrew Morton's book Diana, Her True Story was built from secret recordings Diana had smuggled out of Kensington Palace. The book detailed how Diana threw herself down a staircase at Sandringham while pregnant. She hurt herself repeatedly trying to end her own life because of her dying marriage. Reports say the Queen was so deeply disturbed that she could not bring herself to speak directly to Charles about it for weeks. But none of those tragedies hit deeper than the moment the Queen's home was almost destroyed. It started at 11:33 in the morning on November 20th, 1992. A restorer had left a lamp pressed right against a curtain in the Queen's private chapel. The curtain caught. The fire tore through the ceiling and into the roof structure. 12 fire stations immediately responded. 150 firefighters fought it. Over 100 rooms were destroyed. The Brunswick Tower collapsed, and the roof of St. George's Hall caved in while still burning. The grand reception room ceiling came down in flaming pieces, leaving £150 million of damage. Later that evening, the Queen walked the smoky perimeter of Windsor Castle in a long wax jacket with her hands behind her back. The people who stood close to her described her eyes as shattered in a way her face flatly refused to show. She had hidden inside that castle during the war as a young child. She had walked those rooms her entire life, and now she stood there watching them burn. Amidst the absolute chaos of the evacuation, staff rushed to carry personal objects out by hand through smoke-filled hallways. And here is a detail that has long been rumoured: some of the Queen's most deeply personal jewellery pieces were inside the castle that day, including that Burmese ruby tiara. A few precious pieces did not survive, but the Burmese ruby tiara did not suffer a single scratch. Staff members who were there that night claimed the Queen picked it up from the rubble, held it in both hands, and kissed it while her whole life broke into pieces around her. 4 days later, the Queen stood inside the Guildhall and publicly called 1992 her annus horribilis, her horrible year. Right then her voice cracked. It was one of those very rare moments in her long public life where raw, private pain flashed across her face for everyone to see. That very same month, she chose to wear the Burmese ruby tiara. Honestly, through every single one of those heavy tragedies, she wore it. Somehow that headpiece gave her real hope and the inner strength to keep pushing forward. It reminded her that every storm eventually passes, that she would survive, and that those 96 ruby stones were still holding the line between her and something far worse. So, when that precious tiara suddenly went missing in the late part of 2001, the Queen truly panicked. What would happen now? Could she find the strength to keep moving forward without it? From that exact moment, a cold feeling settled deep over her, one she simply could not shake. It was a dark feeling that something was coming, something unlike anything she had ever faced before. Then, 3 weeks later, something happened that absolutely nobody inside that royal household would ever forget. Camilla walked right in herself, casually carrying the missing tiara. She looked completely innocent. Walking straight up to Elizabeth, she hugged her, even though the stiff Queen did not open her arms in return. Then she held out the tiara with a bright smile, saying, "Thank you for letting her have it." In that instant, a cold fury flashed deep behind the Queen's eyes. With quiet control, she told Camilla that they had been desperately looking for the tiara and that Camilla had absolutely no right to take it. Camilla's smug smile never even wavered. She claimed she had no idea the Queen had been looking for it, insisting she had taken the piece with a clean heart. Of course, none of that was actually true. Whispers from inside the household claimed Camilla had actually worn the tiara at a private party during those 3 weeks. She apparently knew the Queen was losing her mind searching for it, and her response to that news was just 3 brutal words. "Who cares anyway?" The Queen said absolutely nothing more. But her mind was completely made up in that single moment. Camilla would never be allowed near any of these sacred jewels again. Not one of them, not ever. The ruby tiara was back in her hands, but the Queen never stopped feeling that something fundamental had been broken beyond all repair. The protective energy was disturbed. That spiritual armor had been interrupted, and the lingering feeling that something horrible was on its way never truly left her. She was right. In February 2002, something devastating happened. Princess Margaret suffered a massive stroke. Margaret had already been incredibly fragile, suffering smaller strokes the previous year and badly scalding both feet in a bath accident that left her partially unable to walk and trapped in constant pain. But this final devastating stroke came fast and brutal, hitting in the weeks immediately following the disturbance of that sacred tiara. She passed away on February 9, 2002. Margaret was not simply the Queen's sister, she was the last person alive who had shared Elizabeth's entire childhood beginning. As small children, they had hidden together inside Windsor Castle during the war, playing in the very same nursery and wearing the exact same clothes. Elizabeth had lost the last person who truly knew her before she became the Queen. Then, just 2 months later, in April 2002, the beloved Queen Mother died at 101. The legendary woman who refused to leave London during the Blitz, when every advisor begged her to go, who walked the bombed streets of the East End in her hat and pearls, absolutely refusing to be broken, was gone just 2 months after. Margaret. Elizabeth never fully recovered after those devastating deaths, and she believed that some unseen force had a hand in them. Maybe it was the simple fact that she had not been at her strongest after the disappearance of that tiara. Maybe she blamed herself for deeply feeling that something bad would happen, and then it did. Perhaps she blamed herself for those tragic deaths. No one really knows, but she made an incredibly tough final decision. No one tainted with bad intentions would ever come near her most sacred jewels. She declared that anyone who did not deserve to wear them would never wear them, not while she had breath in her body. After those funerals, she instructed Kelly that the Burmese ruby tiara and several other highly personal pieces must be moved to a separate, highly secure location, accessible only to Kelly and the Queen herself. No written record of this quiet order ever entered any public document, but it was followed without a single question from that day forward. The Burmese ruby tiara has never been seen publicly since the Queen's death. Yet the story of what Elizabeth absolutely refused to surrender does not end with just one tiara. There are several other legendary pieces, each one carrying its own dark history of blood, grief, and ruthless conquest. Each has its own dark, unsettling reason to stay out of Camilla's hands, especially the diamond. That legendary diamond ripped directly from a child king. Elizabeth wore that heavy coronation necklace the same way a soldier wears a scar. She never layered it with other jewellery like previous queens had done, because she understood that what this piece carried was already far heavier than anything that could be placed next to it. From her coronation back in 1953 to the final years of her historic reign, not once did she offer it to another woman. And the reason it weighed so heavily goes back to a 10-year-old boy whose stolen diamond sits at its centre to this day. In 1849, British soldiers dismantled one of the most powerful sprawling kingdoms in Asia. They dragged a young child named Dulip Singh off his throne, cruelly separated him from his mother, shipped him across the world, and stole the most valuable stone from his royal treasury. That stone became the Law Diamond, a 22-carat centrepiece inside a necklace worn at every British coronation for the next 170 years. And the child they took it from spent the rest of his tragic life trying desperately to get it back, dying, broken and completely alone before he ever came close. Dulip Singh was the very last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire. His father, Ranjit Singh, had built that empire into something truly formidable, a massive kingdom that stretched across northern India and successfully held its own against intense British pressure during his entire lifetime. When Ranjit died, and the unstable regencies that followed rapidly collapsed into absolute chaos, the predatory East India Company moved in with overwhelming military force. 2 brutal wars followed. Dulip Singh was torn from his throne and separated from his mother, Rani Jindal, who was imprisoned and then exiled to Nepal before he was transported to Britain and forced to convert to Christianity. When Dulip Singh finally grew up, he fought back with absolutely everything he had, desperate to reclaim everything that had ever been stolen from him. But he lost each battle. He died in Paris in 1893 inside a cheap hotel room at 55 years old. The royal was impoverished, stateless, and entirely estranged from most of his children. Meanwhile, the diamond seized from him at 10-year-old had already been worn at 2 grand British coronations. Yet his name appears in no official record connected to that stone. The necklace itself was constructed in 1858 by the royal jewellers Gar from a deep darkness of its own. Queen Victoria had actually lost a magnificent collection of family diamonds and pearls to her uncle, the King of Hanover, following a bitter legal battle that dragged on for decades. By then she was completely desperate to create a masterpiece that would eclipse every single one of those diamonds Shen had lost. So she went straight into her deepest vaults, pulled out old ceremonial swords and obsolete weaponry left sitting for decades, broke them apart, and used those ancient stones to fashion her replacements. That coronation necklace was forged from the metal of those broken weapons, centering a stolen child's diamond. Elizabeth wore that heavy piece to Philip's funeral back in April 2021. She sat completely alone at St. George's Chapel, cut off from her family by those strict COVID restrictions. Just a tiny, grieving figure in black, with that heavy necklace at her throat and nobody beside her. She never offered it to another soul. She never even considered it. Those pieces carried a heavy, dark energy, a weight she did not trust in the wrong hands. Camilla had once remarked casually and brightly that she hoped to wear that necklace someday, as if it were just a matter of waiting. Naturally, that comment reached the Queen, and she, in that characteristically quiet way she delivered her deepest cuts, remarked that perhaps Camilla could wear it in her next life, if she proved worthy of it even then. With a stolen child king's diamond at its centre, Elizabeth bore the weight of that coronation necklace alone for 70 years, yet the next piece in the collection is darker still. Made from chips of the crown itself, Elizabeth wore that heavy Cullinan brooch as a tactical weapon. It was never chosen for beauty, it was chosen for absolute authority. She wore it when she had to communicate things that mere words would only diminish. For 70 years that brooch never left her body for anyone else. Under no circumstance. Both of those diamonds were cut from the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found in human history. Discovered in January 1905 in a South African mine, the Cullinan diamond weighed an astonishing 3,106 carats, roughly the size of a closed adult fist. That ground had always belonged to black South Africans. The miners who dug those tunnels every single day had no legal rights, no ownership claims, and absolutely no share in what was pulled from the earth beneath them. Their names appear nowhere in any official record ever connected to that stone. The diamond from their ground was purchased by the South African government, presented to King Edward III as a birthday gift, and shipped to Amsterdam, where the Asher brothers cut it into 9 major stones. Those 2 largest pieces were used to craft the king's crown and his royal sceptre, the 2 most sacred, powerful objects in the entire British monarchy. The pieces left over were eventually refashioned into a brooch, but even those leftovers were massive. Together they weighed over 150 carats taken from the exact same stone used for that crown and sceptre. It was the exact same diamond, just different pieces. and Elizabeth treated that brooch precisely like what it was, a piece of the crown itself. She wore them proudly to the state opening of Parliament year after year. She wore them publicly in the dark weeks following Diana's death in 1997, when crowds gathered outside the palaces demanding visible grief, putting the entire institution under the heaviest pressure of its modern existence. Elizabeth knew that giving those stones to any other woman meant handing over a piece of the crown itself. For 70 years, those precious diamonds never once left her own body for anyone else. Not once. People close to the Queen started describing a highly specific, deeply unsettling pattern they noticed. Whenever Camilla was in rooms holding the private collection, she stared at those pieces with an intensity that made the palace staff deeply uncomfortable, asking endless questions about their valuations, histories, and exact storage locations. One former lady-in-waiting described her as possessing a collector's eye, meaning she studied those priceless jewels the way a person carefully studies something they are already planning to claim. Privately, she told a close friend she would outlast the restrictions and get exactly what she wanted in the end. The very next piece Elizabeth inherited was forged entirely out of pure grief, and it all started with Queen Victoria and the crown she created from her own sorrow. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert stopped breathing inside Windsor Castle. He was only 42 years old, and Queen Victoria held his hand as he slipped away. What she did in the dark hours immediately afterward is almost impossible to comprehend even today. She ordered a plaster cast made of Albert's face and both of his hands while his body was still warm. For the remaining 39 years of her life, she slept every single night with that plaster cast of his cold right hand resting beside her in bed. Every morning his clothes were laid out fresh, as though he was still alive and about to get dressed. Hot water was brought to his shaving basin exactly on schedule. Even his chamber pot was cleaned and replaced daily. She wore solid black every day for 39 years without a single deviation. Albert had died of typhoid fever contracted from the sewage system beneath Windsor Castle, a system engineers had flagged as dangerously unsanitary for years in reports that were completely ignored. The much darker theory carried quietly by modern historians is that Albert was already being slowly consumed by stomach cancer, and the typhoid only finished what was already inevitable. But either way, Victoria watched him waste away slowly over weeks, sat beside him through every single day of it, held his hand when he stopped breathing, and emerged from that room a completely different person. 9 years into that terrible grief, Victoria commissioned the miniature crown. She pried diamonds from her own personal necklace stones she had worn directly against her skin and had them reset into a tiny silver crown, glittering with 1,187 of her own stones. She refused to touch any stones from the state collection, using only her own. That tiny crown was built from her body outward, designed to sit directly on top of the white widow's cap she wore on her head every single day. She wore it at her Golden Jubilee in 1887, her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, and at every major state occasion of her later reign. When she died at Osborne House on January 22, 1901, that crown was placed atop her coffin. What almost nobody knows is what else went inside with her. Victoria had left highly specific instructions that plaster cast of Albert's right hand was to be placed directly inside the coffin beside her cold body covered in flowers, so that mourners standing at the casket could never see it. She was buried holding the hand of the man she had lost 39 years before. That small crown was placed right on top of Victoria's coffin during the entire funeral procession and the lying in state. It sat on the coffin while the mourners filed past, but it was not buried with her. After the funeral ended, they returned it to the royal collection. Then, in 1937, King George VI had it deposited in the Jewel House at the Tower of London. Elizabeth never retrieved this crown from the Tower, where it was placed in 1937. For 70 years she left it alone in the dark, a deliberate choice. This was the most specific act of protection in her entire handling of the collection. She understood what that crown was. It was no mere tiara. It was a burial object built from one woman's body and her endless, heavy sorrow. To bring it out to place it on a living head would have been a complete desecration. She gave Victoria's grief the only real dignity still left to it: silence, absolute stillness, and the dark. Victoria's deep grief was sealed permanently inside that gold crown, and Elizabeth made sure it remained completely untouched. The next historic piece survived something far worse than grief. It survived a bloody revolution, smuggled right through a violent revolution. In the hot summer of 1917, a British art dealer named Bertie Stopford disguised himself as a common street workman, slipped inside a grand palace in revolutionary St. Petersburg, and broke straight into a hidden safe tucked inside a bedroom, packed all the contents into 2 battered old Gladstone bags, then walked right back past the Revolutionary Guards without once being stopped. Inside those bags lay the heavy Vladimir tiara. The terrifying reason it had to be smuggled out in a worker's disguise through a city on fire is a dark story that ends with 7 people shot dead in a cold basement. The youngest of them was only 13 years old. This tiara had belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, one of the absolute most powerful women in the Romanov court, a German princess who made herself far more fiercely royalist than anyone born Russian. When the bloody revolution erupted, she fled in panic to Western Europe, but her priceless jewels were still locked tightly away in a hidden wall, safe inside her private bedroom at the Grand Vladimir Palace, and St. Petersburg was no longer safe for anyone connected to the Romanov name. Stopford went in after them. He had deep connections to the British aristocracy and intelligence. He located the safe, packed the tiara into those bags, and walked out. The fragile tiara was badly damaged during the rough journey, its delicate diamond framework bent and compressed inside the leather bags, practically tearing itself apart. While Stopford was walking those bags to safety, the tragic Romano family was already being moved toward their terrible end. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga Katana, Maria Anastasia, and Alexei, were led to a dark basement room in the Ipatvi house in Yekaterinburg. They were told they were being moved purely for their own protection. In July 1918, they were shot. All 7 of them, the young children, killed right alongside their parents. When the first round of gunfire failed to kill everyone, the guards moved in with sharp bayonets. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 long centuries ended forever in that basement. The youngest child was only 13 years old. The tiara survived. It sits in the royal collection. Its family is gone forever. Queen Mary purchased the damaged tiara in 1921 and had Gerard repair it. She had it fitted with clever, interchangeable pendant drops. These included the original Baroque pearls and a set of Cambridge emeralds that could be easily swapped in for grand formal occasions. Those Cambridge emeralds carried their own dark history, passed down through fractured branches of the royal family across generations of highly disputed wills and contested successions. Every single time Elizabeth wore the tiara with those emerald drops, it carried 2 layers of painful history. Elizabeth inherited it in 1953 and wore it throughout her long reign. Angela Kelly described the process of swapping those pendant drops as a high-stakes operation requiring roughly 1 hour and bare hands throughout. No gloves at any point. The mechanics were too delicate and the stones too precious to have any barrier between the fingers and the platinum frame. One moment of uncertainty and a precious stone worth millions would hit the floor. Elizabeth sat completely still through the entire lengthy process, like a woman who understood that certain things must be managed with absolute care every single time. Of all the pieces Camilla watched from outside the room, the Vladimir tiara was one of 2 she wanted specifically by name. Sources close to her household described her as having made it clear on more than one occasion that she considered it among the select pieces appropriate for a future queen consort. She did not merely admire it in passing, she wanted it specifically by name. Elizabeth knew this and wore it on no head but her own for all the remaining years of her reign. Since Elizabeth's death, the Vladimir tiara has appeared publicly on Catherine, Princess of Wales, not on Camilla. Royal jewellery at this high level does not move by accident. The deliberate positioning of that historic tiara on Catherine's head instead of Camilla's is read by everyone who understands how these royal decisions are made as exactly what it appears to be. A choice, a direction, a quiet continuation of a boundary Elizabeth drew, and someone inside that family is still firmly holding to it. The Vladimir survived a revolution and 7 decades on one woman's head and has been steered deliberately away from Camilla even to this very day. But the final piece on this list carries the most complete, shocking story of all, because this is one Camilla actually already has. The tiara that practically lived on Elizabeth's face for 70 years. What it means on Camilla's head now is the big question, the face behind the tiara. In October 2023, just 13 months after Elizabeth died, Camilla walked into a formal dinner at Mansion House. The room felt the shift before anyone could even process what they were seeing. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara was sitting on her head. People instantly stopped talking. Some looked away, others just stared, because that tiara was not just a piece of jewellery to anyone in that room. For 7 decades it had been Elizabeth's face, her silhouette, the image pressed into every coin stamp and banknote that passed through millions of hands across the world. And now it was sitting on Camilla, the very woman Elizabeth had spent years trying to keep at a safe distance. The room did not erupt in anger. It went quiet in a way that was somehow much worse. Because what everyone felt in that heavy moment was not simple rage. It was the sudden, devastating understanding that Elizabeth was truly gone forever, and the protective walls she had spent her entire life building had died right along with her. Commissioned in 1893, the tiara was a wedding gift for the future, Queen Mary paid for by a dedicated group of wealthy young women who pooled their money in her honour. Queen Mary handed it down to Elizabeth as a wedding present in 1947, calling it her absolute most treasured possession. Elizabeth wore it on her own wedding day and basically never stopped for the next 70 years. It sat on her head for every single meeting with American presidents, from Truman to Biden. She wore it through those brutal years when her family was publicly disintegrating around her. It was there, after Diana died, when the entire monarchy was fighting just to survive. Through every private heartbreak and heavy public duty her family ever demanded, she wore it without fail. Every time she put it on the crown, absorbed more of that heavy history and personal cost. By her final days, it simply was not just a piece of jewellery anymore. It was the tangible proof of a woman who kept the entire empire together for 70 years through absolute unyielding willpower. No other woman was permitted to wear it while she lived. Not Anne, not Diana, not Sarah, Sophie, Catherine, or Camilla. Elizabeth quietly made sure of that without ever having to utter a single word about it out loud. She knew she had no legal power to stop the headpiece from eventually passing to the next queen consort. The crown would demand it, and she understood that reality completely. Yet palace insiders described her private thoughts on that unavoidable transfer as one of the heaviest, most agonizing burdens she carried in those final years of her life. She could not stop it, but she would not accept it. Sources claim she spoke in secret to her most loyal aide, Kelly, about the headpiece during her final months. She ordered it watched closely, monitored at all times. Elizabeth did the only thing she could. She was trying to shield something she loved from a future she already saw coming and had no power to block. Camilla told a confidant back in the early 2000s that she would outlast every single rule Elizabeth put in her way. She was right. Today she wears the Girls of Great Britain tiara. She has claimed pieces from the royal collection far quicker and more aggressively than anyone who actually knew the Queen ever anticipated. Every piece she wears now represents much more than a simple jewel. It is the undoing of a conscious decision. It is Camilla walking straight through a door Elizabeth spent her whole life locking tight. Princess Anne inherited specific, deeply personal items from her mother after she passed, and she sat in on every closed-door meeting regarding where those precious pieces would end up. Insiders say Anne was fierce and totally unyielding about carrying out exactly what her mother had wanted, refusing to let even one of those instructions be softened or reinterpreted just to favour Camilla. Whether Anne can actually hold the line against everything Camilla still intends to take is a question no one in the palace can answer yet. But make no mistake, Elizabeth saw this coming. She felt the heavy burden of what she was powerless to stop. In those final months, whispering in quiet rooms with her most trusted confidantes, she did everything a dying queen could do to ensure the things she loved would not be surrendered without a fight. The tiara rests on Camilla's head today, but the quiet war Elizabeth started is far from over. Not even close.